Hello, my name is Chris Maurin, and on behalf of the Acton Institute, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 2021 Calihan Lecture and Annual Presentation of the Novak Award. May I first extend a special welcome to all of you joining us on live stream. Created in 2000, thanks to the generosity of Joseph L. Calihan and named after the theologian Michael Novak, the Novak Award rewards outstanding research into the relationship between theology, economic freedom, and a free and virtuous society by recognizing those early career scholars who demonstrate intellectual merit in advancing the understanding of theology's connection to themes of freedom, especially economic liberty. It comes with a $15,000 prize. In past years, it has been awarded to scholars around the globe, including Argentina, Brazil, Australia, France, Singapore, the United States, Finland, Germany, Lithuania, and Poland, to name a few. This year, the Novak Award has been awarded to Dr. Orlando Samões. Dr. Samões is the head of the undergraduate degree program in Political Science and International Relations at the Institute for Political Studies at the Universidade Católica Portuguesa, as well as the editor-in-chief of Nova Cidadania Quarterly Journal. He teaches at the university in the Great Books curriculum on figures such as Adam Smith, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Publius. He also teaches decision theory, including game theory and public choice economics. Dr. Samões also teaches political science at Católica Lisbon School of Business and Economics. Dr. Samões received his PhD in political science from the Universidade Católica Portuguesa with a thesis entitled Natural Liberty and Virtue, a study on the ideas of self-love and benevolence in Adam Smith's thought. His current research concerns political economy and political theory with an emphasis on the intersections of political, moral, and economic principles. One of the requirements of accepting the Novak Award is that the winner is required to deliver the Calihan Lecture, named, of course, after the late Joseph Calihan. Dr. Samões' lecture today will be published as a longer paper in the Acton Institute's peer-reviewed academic journal, the Journal of Markets and Morality. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Samões to deliver the 2021 Calihan Lecture.
10 years ago, in 2011, I ran a series of research workshops about the moral dimensions of a free society at the Institute for Political Studies of the Catholic University of Portugal. I taught the workshops with Professor João Carlos Espada every Thursday during lunch break, and for more than 2 years. I was introduced to Michael Novak in one of those sessions, and that I discovered one of the most inspiring research programs that then I re-encountered some of the themes in my thesis. I was thrilled to come across with the works also of Rodney Stark, Robert Royal, the latter of whom ended attending some of our gatherings in Portugal and in person. Those seminars still deeply motivate my current academic endeavors and adventures. 20 years ago, almost to the day, but not exactly, back in 2001, Michael Novak himself held a Tocqueville lecture at our institute, and precisely about Tocqueville. This was the main lecture launching our commencement ceremonies, our diploma ceremony, and one I would only read on paper because at that time I didn't have the idea that the IEP even existed. It is therefore with great enthusiasm that I will start this year's lecture by recalling what brought me here. The theme of my presentation will be the invisible hand. I've chosen this topic after considering the many other and probably equally good alternatives. I'll focus in two questions. First, does the invisible hand metaphor helps us understand the commercial society? And second, does it help us to cope with the tensions between self-interest and benevolence? Adam Smith is among the most well-known thinkers in the history of humankind. At times, it seems that everybody presumes to know at least a little of his work. As Edwin West reminds us, some people and even some critics regard Adam Smith as simply the classical apologist of capitalism, the insensitive theorizer, the man who believed in the survival of the fittest in a world dominated by a cash nexus, a ruthless war-like competition. But as all who actually read him know, these descriptions are far from the truth. Adam Smith was rather concerned, as a professor of moral philosophy taught by Francis Hutcheson should be, with finding the sources of the good. The experience of living in the intellectual atmosphere of the 18th century inspired him to search for the right balance of feelings and affections. He doesn't exclude any sentiment from his system of morals. As he once puts it so clearly, let me quote from Adam Smith, virtue consists not in any one affection, but in the proper degree of all affections. And the very first sentence of the theory of moral sentiments gives us an excellent introduction to his wider thesis. He starts by saying, how selfish soever man might be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. In this sentence, every word matters. Perhaps in a Scottish atmosphere, too influenced by Adam Smith, by Mandeville, by Bernard Mandeville, these were times when it was supposed that all men were simply selfish. But mere observation will help us discover that there is more than one principle of human nature. We also learn that pleasure matters and that the happiness of others interferes with our own. Our interest in others sets us in motion. Someone else's fortune is important to us. Nonetheless, to many readers, Adam Smith's emphasis on the role of interest sounded new in his second book, The Wealth of Nations. There, Adam Smith discusses the advantages of what he calls the simple system of natural liberty, a situation in which each participant seems to be concerned with his particular interests. According to some readers, it was incoherent to write favorably of a moral bond aiming at benevolence in one book, and about the self-interested impulse for bread, beer, or butcher's meat in the other book. These difficulties explain why the so-called Das Adam Smith problem emerged slowly in Germany, hence my accent saying problem, almost the day after the publication of The Wealth of Nations. The problem survived the 19th century and remains very much alive today. For a number of commentators, the apparent incompatibility of the books meant that we should either discard Smith or accept the line of thought in The Wealth of Nations because he must have preferred self-interest to sympathy in the wide spectrum of motivations for human action. My interpretation differs from these conclusions. Adam Smith was, after all, deeply interested in the relationship between morals, economic freedom, and a free and virtuous society. For him, these ideas were not mutually exclusive. Far from it. I will argue that his proposal for a new commercial society actually imparts a system of morals which emphasizes benevolence. Michael Novak himself is a most distinguished author who also worked with the utmost elegance on the connections between free society core ethics and economic prosperity. As his editor, Edward Youngkins, once stated, and I quote, Novak explains that Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill were wise to view economics as a branch of moral philosophy. Economics should be treated not only as a mathematical and a moral science, but also as a humanist vocation. Every person is an acting subject, capable of reflection and choice, faced with scarcities inherent in nature, and sensing the call to barter, trade, create, and better their condition. He adds, political economy is the study of human action. It is the branch of moral philosophy that studies what is right and what is wrong in dealing with scarcity and optimizing prosperity. End of quote. Let's explore this possibility by starting with the concept Smith is most famous for, the invisible hand. The invisible hand is perhaps the most known and also misrepresentative expression of Smith's work. Smith probably wouldn't have guessed it would become known for describing the operations of a free market order. As it is only mentioned twice or three times, considering the one in astronomy, in the history of astronomy, some have considered it merely incidental to his scheme. It was by chance. In the history of astronomy, Smith explains just before the famous sentence that only irregular events of nature, such as thunder, lightning, were at first attributed to invisible beings. He meant that normal situations eventually cease by their regularity to be explained by divine entities. The sentence came as follows. Fire burns and water refreshes. Heavy bodies descend and lighter substances fly upwards by the necessity of their own nature, nor was the invisible hand of Jupiter ever apprehended to be employed in those matters. Smith was thought to be at Oxford when he wrote this passage in astronomy. So this is likely the first time he used the concept. It is almost certainly different from the other two invisible hands, which don't belong to Jupiter. The regularities they inspire will be derived from human-handed activities rather than heavenly bodies. And it took more than 100 years for readers to notice them in his writings. We could even argue that it wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that the phrase invisible hand was directly addressed in Samuelson's book, Economics, an introductory analysis. And it was seen as the pathway to an efficient equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market. Those involved in the Lang versus Hayek debate on efficiency between free markets and central planning had also probably heard about the invisible hand. Muhammad Ilikowski argues that the invisible hand describes not only the market economy, but also the working of natural science. Salim Rashid calls it the directing hand of the deity. Jerry Avensky writes that the invisible hand is the hand of the deity had designated the economy of nature. Others, like Raphael and Crystal, have underlined precisely the opposite. The invisible hand is an artifact to conceal the lack of religious convictions. That Adam Smith was more than a skeptic and probably even an atheistic, as David Hume, is argued by Spencer Pack, according to whom the hand is a secular device. The invisible hand has accumulated probably millions of adjectives and broad meanings. I can only name but a few. Some people say the invisible aspect refers to gentleness. Others say it is wise and far-reaching. It can be the dead hand. Others said the grabbing hand. Even for those unopposed to the idea of free markets. Those who do oppose free markets describe it, for example, as a backhand or a trembling hand. In the same vein, others claim it to be amputated or simply palsied. On this side of the quarrel, even when perfectly functional, this hand can be bloody or simply the iron fist of competition. For those who interpret it as a pro-market device like George W. Bush, former president of the United States, the hand, and I'm quoting, improves the lives of people as contrasted with the government's invisible foot that tramples on people's hopes and destroys their dreams. For Milton Friedman, Smith's unseen hand represents, quote, the power of the market to produce our food, our clothing, our housing, end of quote, and also serves as a scheme of coordination without central planning. Economists in this school describe its astonishing capacity to handle a coordination problem of truly enormous proportion. For John Elster, the invisible hand shapes human affairs, but by producing unintended consequences or externalities. Oswald argues that there is a rationality to its final outcomes. The invisible hand is invisible to the extent that it allows the coordination of unseen features of the commercial society, such as the relative scarcity of a supplied good in relation to a consumer's willingness to pay. It is possible to argue that some subjects like biology or medicine, which were developing during Smith's lifetime, use the word invisible to represent the theme of modern science. Science would entail the study of relations between elements we cannot see with our bare eyes. If this is true, the term signifies a passage from the rudimentary knowledge to the advent of a serious science of what we now call economics. The invisible hand works by coordinating intertwining interests and appears to clash with Smith's desires to incorporate benevolence into human motivation. But as Milton Friedman argues, disregard for our own interests turns out, for Smith, to be more successful in the field of benevolence than government actions. And I quote from him, from Friedman. He says, the invisible hand of the market was far more effective than the invisible hand of government in mobilizing not only material resources for immediate self-seeking ends, but also sympathy for unselfish charitable ends. End of quote. As with benevolence, self-interest also contrasts fundamentally and absolutely with any possible government initiative. It is not possible to extract it by force. But on the other hand, self-interest is so strong a passion, so deeply embedded in humans and inculcated by nature that it becomes extremely difficult to, or impossible to steer. While the concept of interest seems to describe an individualistic motivation, the idea of sympathy in theory of moral sentiments describes almost the contrary. When we break it down, however, self-interested behavior is not simply selfishness, and sympathy is not simply benevolence. For Smith, these concepts were not separated into watertight compartments. The relationship between different kinds of affections was an integral part of his overall scheme. While Hume concluded that kindness tends to overbalance selfish motivations, Smith did not. Smith also departed from his teacher, Francis Hutchinson, whose ideas, though moderate in this regard, could not ascribe a bold moral value to self-love. But Smith did pick up from Hutchinson the basic importance of moral values within economic inquiry. Hutchinson thought that benevolence and self-love struggled against each other in a tug of war, but ultimately benevolence wins because it is the real end of all human action. Where Smith departs from Hutchinson, he becomes more inclined toward Bishop Butler sermons and the dissertation of the nature of virtue. Bishop Butler also includes interest in his moral philosophy and believes that humanity commands a wide variety of principles rather than a single one, be it benevolence or any other force of gravity. Indeed, his preface to the sermons, Butler writes a passage from which Smith seems to derive much of his own thought. It is long, but let me share it with you. It is long, but it is important. It is, if observation be true, it follows that self-love and benevolence, virtue and interest are not to be opposed, but only to be distinguished from each other. In the same way as virtue and any other particular fashion, love of arts, suppose, are to be distinguished. Everything is what it is and not another thing. The goodness or badness of actions does not arise from hence that the epithet interest or disinterested. And then he goes on, he explains this, that the idea that you cannot stamp the morality of the good simply by saying that it was interested or not interested. And he concludes that self-love in its due degree is as just and morally good as any affection whatever. Butler believed that self-love could be good, could be a good thing if properly constrained, for example, by human conscience. Self-love is a very general desire, his expression, whose relationship to benevolence cannot be described by mere opposition. As Eugene Heath, another commentator, defines Butler's position, self-love is a general desire for one's happiness, not a passion with an intentional orientation to particular objects. There is no reason not to love the self. Moreover, self-love can be virtue if it coincides with actions that benefit others. Perhaps more importantly, and let me take this out, he argues that benevolence is no more disinterested than particular passions. If someone insists that an action is interested, it is irrelevant for Butler. An action can be evil and yet disinterested. And I quote from him again, benevolence towards particular persons might be to a degree of weakness and so blamable. And disinterestedness is so far from being in itself commendable that the utmost possible depravity which we can in imagination conceive is that of disinterested cruelty. Ultimately, self-love, benevolence, and interest are not commendable or reprehensible on face value. Sometimes some forms of interest can be good and some forms of disinterest can be bad. For Butler, we cannot judge the morality of an action by looking at these adjectives alone. The morality of an action exists before it is evaluated. And consciously or not, Butler echoes Smith in the second chapter of Book 4 in The Wealth of Nations, precisely where the invisible hand appears. They were both working on the idea that some self-interested actions could have an unintended positive impact on others, allying the tensions between self-love and benevolence. Let us draw attention to Smith's passage and let us compare the two. Here I have placed the two. Smith says every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. he can generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he's promoting. He intends only his own gain, and he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. The difference between Smith and Butler lies in Butler's attributing the same effects to another invisible, yet more defined leadership. Butler's reasoning in 1726 or 29, depends on the edition, half a century earlier tells us, so Butler says, it might be added that as persons without any conviction from reason of the desirableness of life would yet, of course, preserve it merely from appetite of hunger. So by acting merely from regard supposed to reputation without any consideration of the good of others, men often contribute to the public good. In both these instances, they are plainly instruments in the hands of another, in the hands of providence, to carry on ends, the preservation of the individual and good of society, which they themselves have not in their view or intention. The words end, the words intention, the words hands are similar. Both Butler and Smith were already separating intentions from outcomes. They alluded to what Friedrich Hayek in the 20th century called spontaneous orders, the complex coordination of information arising from the interaction, human interaction, rather than central authority. For Hayek, two preeminent examples of spontaneous orders were the price system and language itself. Smith also thought that language was a good example of how human action creates rules and results without anyone's intentions or design. Smith's contemporary Adam Ferguson had similar ideas describing forms of society that arise without a single projector. We owe to Ferguson the expression, the results of human action, but not of human design. I have it here too for us to recall. He is one of the first to mention. He is quoting from a classical author, but still. Adam Ferguson is one of the first, at least in modern times, to say this: nations stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. Let us see now the invisible hand in the theory of moral sentiments. The first ever mention of the invisible hand happens and appears in the middle of the theory of moral sentiments, almost in the middle. Smith takes his inspiration from an unexpected author, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The dawn of the commercial society is of crucial importance for these thinkers and serves as the basis for some additional concerns, for many moral concerns. We can find important similarities between Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality and Smith's TNS. They would probably agree on the fact that the satisfaction of natural needs occurred easily in the commercial era. They both knew that commerce was founded on persuasion. They also understood that persuading someone to trade is a way of appealing to her self-love. Smith departs from Rousseau when he observes that the demand for vanities increases as societies get wealthier. We are keen to move on from demanding food to demanding superficial objects as soon as our welfare allows it. There are many examples around TMS and wealth of nations. But Smith sees this as a positive development. In the commercial era, we can easily satisfy our basic needs. As he says, the wages of the meanest laborer can supply them, the basic needs. In our society, material goods are not meant to address our physical needs, but our rather other types of satisfaction. what we ultimately seek is to be seen by others, admired by others. Our desire to better our condition is how we acquire those ends. And I quote from Smith, "We desire of becoming the proper objects of respect, of deserving and obtaining this credit and rank among our equals. And this desire is perhaps the stronger of all our desires. And our anxiety to obtain the advantages of fortune is accordingly much more excited and irritated by this desire than by that of supplying all the necessities and conveniences of the body, which are always very easily supplied." These desires reflect Smith's idea of virtue. We want praise, but we want praise because we ascribe value to praiseworthiness. Contrary to Rousseau, for whom the disposition to seek approval of others is linked to a real indifference between good and evil, for Smith, a man desires not only to be praised, but praiseworthiness, or to be that thing which, though it should be praised by everybody, is, however, the natural and proper object of praise. What Smith is saying is that we are only capable of conceiving the idea of praise because there must be actions that we consider really praiseworthy. Love of praise, then, is but a derivative manifestation of a more fundamental desire, love of praiseworthiness. This contrasts with Hutchinson, who considered truly virtuous action to be pure or completely disinterested. Only selfless benevolence for Hutchinson would be good. For Smith, this couldn't be the whole truth. It is actually possible to be virtuous while acting from self-interest. And I quote from him again, but I can't even share it. It would be easier. "Regard to private happiness and interest too appear upon many occasions very laudable principles of action. The habits of economy, industry, discretion, attention, and application of thought are generally supposed to be cultivated from self-interested motives, and at the same time are apprehended to be very praiseworthy qualities which deserve the esteem and approbation of everybody." This is said in the theory of moral sentiments, not in Wealth of Nations. Man does not simply work for bread, beer, or butcher's meat. He works foremost in order to be seen favorably by others, that is, to entice the other's sympathy. But there is still another third reason, which many commentators, but also Milton Myers, helpfully pointed out: design and harmony. We want the order, the regular, the harmonious movements of the system, the machine of economy by means of which it is produced. The pleasures of wealth and greatness, when considered in this complex view, strike the imagination as something grand and beautiful and noble. Again, I'm quoting from TMS. From Smith's point of view, the commercial society can be praised for being well-ordered and harmonious. Striving to become richer can be proper for the sake of this harmony. The invisible hand contributes to these balances. As he writes, the differences of wealth and rank among men are by themselves necessary for the prosperity and good order. Smith also discusses the extreme toil and hard labor of what he calls the poor man's son, to emphatically criticize the corruption produced by luxury and wealth. While doing so, he praises poverty and virtue. The phrase where Smith insists that the poor courts the great and the rich whom he hates is almost the simplest translation of a phrase from Rousseau's discourse. And I quote, "For this purpose, he makes his court to all mankind. He serves those whom he hates and is obsequious to those whom he despises." This is almost plagiarism from Rousseau. Rousseau's civilized man then, at the end of the discourse, is similar to Smith's poor man's son. They both get, in the end, no real satisfaction in their extreme dependence on the rich. Smith also argues with Rousseau and agrees with Rousseau when he defines the activity of the rich as being rapacity, precisely where the latter wrote rapines in French. But the similarities end there. For Rousseau, the rich will try to subdue their neighbors since their ambition for dominance has no limits. For Smith, the rich are led by an invisible hand to promote an end that was not part of their intention. Both rich and poor get the sense of enjoyment that Rousseau argues is impossible in a civilized society. In both cases, the hand of the rich distorts dissatisfaction that was felt by the savage in the state of nature for Rousseau and the poor man's son in Smith. Rousseau's hand of the rich in this passage is the cause of our problems. Let us compare again, and I have here both passages. Rousseau says, they, the poor, saw everything change around them, they remain still the same, were obliged to receive their subsistence or steal it from the hand of the rich. And he goes on and he says that the activities of the rich are violence and rapine, and that the rich are like ravenous wolves, which having once tasted human flesh, despise every other food, and thenceforth seek only men to devour. There are some similarities to Adam Smith's passage, and it is the passage in which the invisible hand appears. I have them here side by side. But Rousseau seems to contrast this hand with another hand, which he calls the gracious hand, which by correcting our institutions and giving them an immovable basis has prevented those disorders which would otherwise have arisen from them and caused our happiness to come from those very sources which seem likely to involve us in misery. We can easily argue that Smith's invisible hand stands out from this paragraph that starts to define the rich, and in that sense, it implies to be their hand, the hand of the rich. Smith seems to write this with Rousseau's remarks on the same topic in mind, because both paragraphs have similar structure. But where Rousseau sees a gracious hand, Smith seems to see a hand even more gracious, so gentle that it's like thin air, so gentle that it disappears. In the end, for Smith, the hand is there, but it seems to be gone. In other words, the visible hand of rapacity has a rebound effect, the invisible hand. We can compare the two and reread Smith's theory at its peak here. And he says that they, the rich, are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants. And thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society and affords means to the multiplication of the species. Smith's response to Rousseau could hardly be more significant. Rich and poor get more or less the same access to the joy of security as a result of the workings of another hand that Rousseau did not see. For Smith, they are nearly upon a level. And if some imbalance is found, it functions in favor of the poor. As the rich will still have the trouble of fighting for security by exposing themselves to the risks of conflict with their neighbors. Rousseau and Smith could not be further apart here, could not be more far apart. Smith's commercial society will give satisfaction to all. Smith's commercial society will give satisfaction to all, but slightly more to the poor. For Rousseau, to none. But if we look closer at Smith's last line, we find that if anyone is to feel better off, it is even the beggar in the street. For Smith, kings are still fighting to get the beggar satisfaction under the sun. The commercial society will be good for all, but even better for the poor. This complementarity might help us explain Smith's second invisible hand in the Wealth of Nations, the first we have seen today. There, the invisible hand is precisely what makes everyone's self-interest good for the whole. The invisible hand causes the self-interested industrialist to support the domestic industry by pursuing his own self-interest. The industrialist's self-interest is the domestic industry's interest. The invisible hand combines the two. The moment he does not follow his interest and speaks from the standpoint of the reasons of the public interest, he asks for protective measures for his own broad interest, so to speak. These measures, protective measures, are only possible by the rational design and ultimately uphold a partial interest set in absolute contrast to the common good. Protective measures are not natural in the sense Smith uses the term, natural with capital N. If the merchant alluded to is said to be thinking about public interest and not just his self-interest, he acts in favor of a particular interest in the society, his own. This is a paradox. If you think about your interest, you benefit everyone. If you say you think about everyone's interests, you will only benefit your own interests. This is the outcome of a tension between intentionality and efficiency. For Smith, those who preach good intentions are only whining. Those who direct their self-interest to a fruitful activity instead will uplift the standards of living. This means that the industrialists promote the public good if restricted to self-interest only. And even in a certain narrow sense, I look at this passage, which I think it's so crucial and interesting. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually. This is a matter of efficiency than when he really intends to promote it. I like these italics on the more effectually. The invisible hand promotes then opulence for all and lifts the condition of the poor efficiently. This is the history of the Industrial Revolution, or in Smith's words, the effects of frugality and parsimony in advancing the overall level of capital. Michael Novak, to end where we started, called this progress the transformation. I'm quoting from one of his essays that was published in the book 3-in-1 Essays on Democratic Capitalism, page 223. And he says that the invisible hand helped change people's perceptions of business as a part of human progress. Novak believed that both David Hume and Adam Smith were responsible for what he called, and I'm quoting from Novak, the great moral transformation in Western ethical reality, a transformation they thought for the better, especially from the viewpoint of ordinary people and the poor. I'm now on the minute 41. I would have conclusions, but I know that I must meet the deadline, and therefore I will wrap it up here. And maybe if you have some questions, I will just pinpoint some parts of the conclusion, which I think could be worthwhile, but by no means that I want to go on any further than the 41 minutes. Okay, so thank you very much once more. And with this, I finish for now and wait for your criticism and observations.
Thank you, Orlando. It's great to be with you. I'm Sam Gregg. I'm the Director of Research at the Acton Institute. It's my happy task to pose some questions to you based upon your lecture, as well as your great knowledge of the great Scottish philosopher of the 18th century. You've spoken very eloquently in your presentation about the types of virtues that Smith thought were important for commercial society, and you spent a lot of time talking about the role that self-interest plays in the formation and development of commercial orders. Smith also, however, does say some negative things about commercial society. He's not one that sees that the advance of commerce and the advance of markets is something that's an unalloyed blessing. I was wondering if you could say some things about where Smith sees some deficiencies on the part of markets and commercial society, and some of the remedies he offers for those.
Thank you very much. That is a fundamental and crucial question. I think that to some extent, they were all, and in this not just the Scottish, but also the continental authors, contributing precisely on that end. They were all very concerned with the moral impact of the commercial society. And in principle, there would be a lot of bad things, as you said, to consider. The commercial society could trigger in us a certain degree of vanity. It could make us long for a certain type of sympathy, which would extrapolate the so-called praiseworthiness. We could start to live in the lives of the others and try to show off too much. In commercial societies, Smith says, and he's quoting from Hutchinson, we will tend to parade our riches and conceal our poverty. So he was concerned with the idea of, which we now would call extreme consumption, or he would be also worried with relying too much on debt. That's why he emphasizes always frugality and parsimony as the basis for the society. And he does so because he's a moral philosopher. He wants to emphasize what we called the deferred gratification in time. And he perceived the commercial society as an opportunity to go both ways. We could invest on the virtues of deferred satisfaction and be frugal and invest in the future, be virtuous, or we could rather indulge our present and immediate idea of satisfaction by making use of all the resources we have. And he used the word profligacy, which was a word at the time for being spendthrift. We can be thrifty or spendthrifts. And he, at that time, was very, I think, shrewd, because he implies that individuals, generally speaking, will bound to apprehend the knowledge of a commercial society and refrain from this immediate satisfaction, and we will try to steer our needs into control and self-command ourselves as to be frugal and parsimoniously in our expenses. However, the states and government could be the entities which would rely greatly and gradually more on debt, and therefore the governments could be to blame on a certain degree of profligacy or spendthriftness. I don't know if this word exists, maybe not. So most governments would be rather spendthrifts, and whereas individuals and families would bound to be more parsimonious. This was one of the aspects that made him not to praise commercial societies per se. He was preoccupied. He was concerned. He was very much concerned. And I think that's one of the reasons why he tries to reply to Rousseau, but uses some of his words and style, and sometimes methods. The terms self-love or vanity, they stem from Rousseau's terms of debate. And I think that Adam Smith uses the word natural liberty precisely to emphasize that commercial societies can be anything, and they are very inevitable. They will happen through the process of industrialization. It's almost inevitable. In this way, he's almost, we would call it historicist, slightly, as Marx was to later on. So we would go on from the pasture and shepherds and fishermen society to a feudal society. This feudal society is a society with a lot of protection, where historians only speak of protective measures and are now called mercantilists. At their time, they were just historians, they're not really mercantilists. The school of mercantilism is a notion that Adam Smith implies, but there was not really a formal school. And the decline of mercantilism meant inevitably the passage towards a commercial society. But the commercial society can be many things, really. So we would rather try to emphasize the moral and the morality of our actions as to make the commercial society good. It is an opportunity we have. But this commercial society which can be better for everyone and which can nurture in us good feelings is a commercial society of a certain kind, which I believe it to be natural liberty. He used natural liberty very often as a particular type of the commercial society. And in natural liberty, we will make use of our knowledge, of our propensity, but we will look after each other because we are the mirrors of one another, and we will, learn through each other's actions and through repetition of the good actions of the others. We will learn, or we will start to be more, how can I put it? We are bound to be more habituated to the eye of the impartial spectator as time goes by. For Adam Smith, our morality is a sort of a learning process, which evolve gradually through the observation of the others and their good actions, which will tend to mirror more often than perhaps not so good actions. And but yes, commercial societies can be defying. They will be a challenge.
For you, which follows up very naturally from some of the remarks you just made, but also some references you made in your presentation. And that concerns the role of religion, the role of religion. As you know, there's a lot of debate about where Adam Smith's own religious sentiments were. I'm personally inclined to think he's somewhat of a deist rather than a skeptic or a Christian, but there's debate about all those things. But my question follows up from the previous one, and the question essentially is this. What role does Smith see for religion in tempering some of the tendencies of commercial society that he and others were worried about in the 18th century?
That is certainly a very important question again. And it is at the center of many of the efforts of many important commentators. We really don't know. It seems that Adam Smith is trying to construct an idea of moral approbation as bestowed by what he calls an impartial spectator. And by doing so, these mechanics of the impartial spectator seem to operate through the mere inspection or observation. And sometimes it seems that the pattern from which the impartial spectator measures our actions or evaluates our actions seems to be defined through the workings of mere observation or the way our imagination projects our action from our outside. But sometimes he also implies that it is the opinion of everybody else that could be observing. Sometimes he also implies that the spectator is rather within the breast. It is an impression we have from within and not so much the impartial spectator coming from outside. This impartial spectator, I think it's his attempt to reconstruct a morality which will point towards the same reasoning and ideas as Christianity, but without starting from the point of view that God exists. But he thinks that so it is a sort of a parallel way to reach the same conclusion. And hence, he would praise benevolence as a means for highest virtue of charity. Certainly, he would do that. But while doing so, he also points out that religion can be important in recalling us of this duty to trying to be good. And in one or two passages, he says that religion operates as a sort of a second limit or a second bound that we might have. He says something like, we can be very good without it, but if we have it, then we have another reason to be good. So it is important as to reaffirm and reassure. But he was teaching his students, and it seems to me that he wanted to prove that it was possible to reach the idea that benevolence is the good through a more rational approach. He might have been a sort of a deist. I believe that his ideas of natural liberty and his emphasis on what is natural seems to be of a deist kind. Also, in my studies, I have encountered the influence of Bishop Butler a lot and of Francis Hutchinson, not so much of David Hume. And I know that David Hume was important, but David Hume was rather the very skeptic real here and very deistic. But more recently, there was a very recent book published a year ago, or less than that, and the author, it's called The Unfaithful and the Professor. It's about the friendship between Smith and David Hume. And he tries to say that they're very close, so it could be against my thesis, but it is not. And the reason is because that book is very important, and it calls our attention for their similar the system of beliefs in terms of how can we study nature, not so much about this schism that I found interesting between self-love and benevolence and between the moral dimensions of a free society, where I think that they would be far apart again. So that's why I think that you can always place an angle where we place the two together, and Adam Smith seems a deist, but I think it's from the point of view of trying to eradicate superstition and embrace science. On that, he's similar to David Hume. But that doesn't mean that on the ideas of what is good, that he is close to David Hume. There, I think that he is not. And sometimes we have to consider that these authors from the 18th century, they are not very Catholic because of many things that were going on and discussed at the times. So he would rather get slightly closer to some Calvinistic groups and circles with which he would talk. So he is maybe a sort of a deist, but he's author of nature. can be very Christian, at least, or might confirm some of the Christian virtues. Can be a deist of sorts, but it can be also a Protestant / Calvinistic every now and then. But the role of religion would be important, a second bound, a second reason to be good.
Well, thank you very much for that.
A further check on us.
Thank you very much for that. There's so much more we could talk about it. I'd love to discuss it sometime in the future. The fact, for example, that so many of the people involved in the Scottish Enlightenment were ministers of the Church of Scotland, which is very different to what you find in, for example, continental Europe. But I'm afraid we're out of time for questions now, so I'm going to hand over to the Acton Institute President, Chris Maurin, for the formal presentation.
Well, thank you so much. But let me thank you. Your questions, and I would like to, continue on and on the whole night. So I hope that this was not the last time that we discuss Adam Smith or the Scottish Enlightenment or the 18th century political philosophy, which I think it's really at the core of our of the idea of the prize here, and it's, I think, a crucial century that we should go back to if we want to know more about the moral dimensions of freedom and the free markets.
Thank you, Dr. Samões, for your excellent lecture and for the very engaging conversation led by my colleague, Dr. Samuel Gregg. It's now my honor and duty to formally present the Novak Award. On behalf of the Acton Institute, and in recognition for your outstanding intellectual contributions that undergird the free and virtuous society, I am happy to present to you today the 2021 Novak Award. Thank you again for your outstanding contributions and for the work we can expect from you in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Gregg, and hope seeing you guys in the near future and in person. And we will continue to strive on the connections between morality and free markets, which are so needed and so interesting. Thank you so much to all of you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. We hope that the award assumes a prominent place in your office, perhaps next to that picture of Adam Smith that we see in the background. So I have a couple of...
This was a little bit of a joke, but yes.
I have a few announcements to make by way of closing. First of all, I'd like to remind all of you who are watching online that the deadline for the Novak Award for 2022 is March the 15th. March the 15th, 2022. All information may be found on the Acton Institute's website. I'd also like to alert you to the numerous grants and awards that are available at acton.org/awards. There are many scholarship programs ranging from people who want to travel, who are interested in pursuing particular themes when it comes to markets and morality, as well as those who are engaged in higher degree studies. The last thing I will mention is that the Business Matters Conference, in which many of the subjects that we've talked about today are addressed, albeit in a more contemporary and in a more explicitly business setting, this will be held on February the 24th, 2022. I highly recommend that for all those who are interested in studying these questions. And last of all, I should of course mention Acton University, the Acton Institute's premier academic and business and really everything event that we do on an annual basis. That will be held from June the 20th until June the 23rd, 2022, here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We thank you very much for your attention. We wish you all well, and we hope that this will be a great year for markets and morality in 2022. Thank you.